Hi, everyone, and thank you for tuning into our live online event for tonight, Luiz Rosemberg Filhos Imagens, discovering a masterpiece of Brazilian cinema. The film which we will be discussing tonight, Imagens, has been streaming on cinelimite.com for over 2 weeks right now, and we really hope everybody here has had the opportunity to watch it leading up to tonight's talk. I'm going to briefly introduce myself. My name is William Plotnick, and I'm a current student in the Moving Image Archives and Preservation program at New York University. I hold a master's degree in cinema studies from Columbia University, and I'm the president and co-founder of Limite. Limite, a nonprofit foundation which was founded this summer, is a new 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to expanding accessibility to Brazilian cinema throughout the world and promoting transnational discourse around Brazilian cinema. Since we've launched our website this past summer, we've been running programs dedicated to filmmakers Osimo Bubu, Brazilian film archives, and we just recently, in November, began a new retrospective on the recently passed composer and filmmaker Sergio Ricardo. And I really encourage everybody to check that out. We have a lot more great content coming throughout 2020 and 2021. So I encourage everyone to keep up to date with that exciting content. I'd also like to thank a few groups and people who made tonight's event possible. There's the NYU Department of Cinema Studies, Rio de Janeiro Cinemateca do MAM, which just, by the way, announced its own complete retrospective of Luiz Rosemberg Filho, the filmmaker that we'll be discussing tonight. They announced it. It hasn't started yet, but it will be starting soon. I would encourage everybody to check out their Vimeo account once that retrospective begins and check out their website for more information. I also want to thank K Video and Kavi Borges, the family of Luiz Rosemberg Filho, Gustavo Menezes for translating the film for everybody to see, and my sister Madeline for designing the poster of our event. I want to introduce both of our speakers for tonight. We have Jose Quintal, who has a bachelor's degree in history from UFIF. He has a master's degree in cinema studies, and he is a PhD candidate in cinema studies at Universitat Paris 8 in France. Jose Quintal is currently the cinema coordinator and programmer at Cinemateca do MAM, Rio de Janeiro's Museum of Modern Art. And he is the co-curator of audiovisual preservation symposium at Cineop, Mostra de Cinema de Ouro Preto, since 2017. He was a lecturer at the University in Paris, and he is a member of the National Committee of Brazil of the UNESCO Memory of the World Program. Another speaker tonight is Richard Pena. Richard Pena is a professor of film studies at Columbia University, where he specializes in film theory and international cinema. From 1988 to 2012, he was the program director of the Film Society of Lincoln Center and the director of the New York Film Festival. At the Film Society, Richard Pena organized retrospectives of many film artists, including Michelangelo Antonioni, Sasha Guthrie, Abbas Kiarostami, King Hu, Robert Aldrich, Roberto Gavaldon, Ritwik Ghatak, Kira Muratova, Fei Mu, Jean Eustache, Yosef Shaheen, Yasuhiro Ozu, Carlos Suada, Nagisa Oshima, and Amitabh Bachchan, as well as major film series devoted to African, Israeli, Cuban, Polish, Hungarian, Chinese, Arab, Korean, Swedish, Turkish, German, Taiwanese, and Argentine cinema. Together with Uni France, he created in 1995 Rendezvous with French Cinema, the leading American showcase for new French cinema. A frequent lecturer on film internationally, in 2014 through 2015, he was a visiting professor in Brazilian studies at Princeton, and in 2015 through 2016, a visiting professor in film studies at Harvard. In May 2016, he was the recipient of the Cathedra Bergman at the UNAM in Mexico City, where he offered a 3-part lecture series on the margins of American cinema, and December 2017, where he gave a course in international cinema after 1990 at Beijing University. In 2020, he will be a visiting professor at Frey in Berlin, and he currently hosts WNet Channel 13's weekly Reel 13. And it's very special for me to have Professor Pena here because he taught me a class in Brazilian cinema while I attended Columbia University. Lastly, across from me right now is Luiz's co-founder, Eric Barroso. Eric is a finishing student at NYU Cinema Studies and a programmer based in New York. He is also the co-founder and CEO of Limite. And Eric will be the co-host of tonight's event. So before beginning tonight's event, it's important for me to highlight the Cinemateca Brasileira, which is Brazil's largest film archive. For those of you tuning into this event tonight that may not know, the Cinemateca Brasileira, located in Sao Paulo, has been undergoing a major crisis since the very beginning of the pandemic. This archive holds a great portion of Brazil's audiovisual history, and its entire staff were recently laid off as part of governmental financial cuts for the institution. As such, there is no staff currently managing the archive, and the entire collection is at serious risk of being destroyed. I want to be clear that the crisis the Cinemateca Brasileira is undergoing is not just a national crisis. The neglect by the Brazilian government towards this institution is in fact a global attack on the arts, as access to Brazilian audiovisual history affects us all throughout the world in many different ways. I encourage everyone to do what they can to stay updated on developments related to the institution and to help spread any news that comes out about it. We're going to be putting together a page of resources over on our website, cinelimite.com, so you can know where to look to find out more about what has been going on over at the Cinemateca Brasileira. So to begin tonight's event now, Eric and I decided to put on tonight's event because we both feel that Luiz Rosemberg Filhos' Imagens is a key work of Brazilian cinema that is yet to really receive its due, both nationally in Brazil and internationally. Before talking about Imagens, I briefly want to introduce its director, Luiz Rosemberg. Luiz Rosemberg Filho began his artistic career at age 16 as a painter, and he would go on to work as a film critic before getting started in filmmaking. He began his filmmaking career during the Brazilian military dictatorship with the 1969 film Balada da Página 3, which is a film that is now considered lost. He in fact made also a 1962 short film, which we believe is lost as well. In the same year of 1969, Filho contributed to a compilation film called América do Sexo, with a short called Collagem. This short is indeed an experimental collage type work. It covers topics such as the Brazilian filmmaking and film critics scene, injustices of the military dictatorship that had just begun, sexploitation movies, and more. That film can in fact be found on YouTube, and I would recommend people to check it out. In the early 1970s, Rosenberg would make two of the most groundbreaking cinema marginal, or cinema of invention films, Jardim das Espumas and Imagens. He would also spend time in France with Glauber Rocha, and then would return back to Brazil in 1974. Upon returning back to Brazil, Rosenberg continued to make some of the most radically political and aesthetically challenging Brazilian films of his period. He was also a highly censored filmmaker during the military dictatorship. His 1975 film, Assuntina das Américas, being banned outright, and his Crônica de Industrial from 1978 being banned by the military dictatorship from being screened at Cannes, where it was originally slated to be part of the main competition. At the end of the 1980s and the beginning of the 1990s, Rosenberg made a transition from working in film to video, making works with a more essay-like tone. In the 2000s, in collaboration with producer Cavi Borges, Rosenberg would resurge his career and adopt the digital filmmaking format, going on to make numerous excellent films that explored similar themes to those he focused on throughout his career. Although he passed away just last year, Rosenberg leaves behind 11 feature-length films and 33 short-length films. And I'm not sure if that number is even correct. Most of these films have not yet even been translated, and they're really waiting to be further explored and discovered by international audiences. So we hope that tonight's event is a small step in the right direction there. So for tonight's event, we will be discussing Luiz Rosenberg Filhos' third feature-length film. The goal of tonight's event is discovery. Discovery in the sense that Imagens was a film only found recently, making it an interesting archival research case that can, we hope, open up a larger conversation about the preservation of cinema marginal films. But also, as is stated in the opening credits of the movie, Imagens is probably the most radical of Rosenberg's films, deeply linked to its historical period. Therefore, there is a tremendous need to deal with what is going on in this film, to actually discuss and dissect the politics and images of Imagens. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Eric Bahosu, who's going to introduce the movement of which Imagens is considered to be a part, the Cinema Marginal movement or the Cinema de Invenção movement. Eric, there you go. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. My name is Eric Barroso. I am a student at NYU and a programmer in New York, both for spectacle theater and elsewhere. So when we speak of cinema marginal, we're usually referring to a group of films made in roughly the date range of 1967 to 1973 that exhibit certain characteristics of production, tone, and theme. These films are invariably low budget, often in black and white, although not always, and almost always shot in the urban centers of Brazil, most often São Paulo. We can say that the movement really kicked off with the film A Margem, or The Margin, by Oswaldo Candeias, released in 1967. The film concerns two homeless people in São Paulo, and his films later on would also be about similar subject matter. And then we can say that the movement found its most well-known representatives in Rogério Sganzerla's O Bandido do Luz Vermelho, or The Red Light Bandit, and Júlio Bessani's Matou a Família e Foi ao Cinema, or Killed the Family and Went to the Movies. These films are marked by a sense of alienation and aggression that manifests in an interest in the body and its intensities. While the leaders of Cinema Novo were moving on to bigger, more lavish productions with Embrafilme, the state organ for cinematic production, the Cinema Marginal filmmakers, were decidedly excluded from this club, finding it much harder to gather funds for production, and encountering a much harsher hand when dealing with the censors. A look at any one of these films will quickly reveal the unmoored, antisocial quality of cinema marginal that provoked both Brazilian petit bourgeois morality and the repressive arm of the state, which preserved those values. Nudity, violence, and grotesquerie abound in each of these underground works, as they depict a vision of society where the subaltern writhe and resist against the everyday oppression of Brazilians' political situation of the time period. Now, to really talk about cinema marginal, we have to discuss the one half of this term, which is the word marginal. And to preface this, one should say that the marginal in Portuguese has multiple meanings. It can both mean marginal in the way that we use it in English, but it can also be used to refer to a criminal. So at first, it would seem a perfect descriptor for an underground movement whose works not only largely appealed to small audiences, mostly made up of other Brazilian filmmakers and cineasts, but also one whose films were regularly heavily censored, if not completely blocked from exhibition. These films also, by and large, take those who we would consider to be on the margins of society, petty thieves, circus folks, sex workers, drug addicts, as their protagonists. But many of the filmmakers proper reject the label for several reasons. First, they don't view their films as made of marginal material or for marginal audiences. Both Giulio Bressani and Rogério Scanzerla speak of their work as originating from the people and being for the people. Another possible reason, in the words of Fabio Andrade, would be to speak of the marginal means to acknowledge a center. And in doing so, these filmmakers would be perpetuating the periphery center discourse that has plagued the arts for almost a century now. To speak of Rosenberg's specific place in cinema marginal, he represents both some of the most violent and expressive aesthetic tendencies of the movement. His work displays aggression towards the body in many different forms, often allegorizing the repressive force of the colonizer. His first film, Jardim das Espumas, features a narrative regarding alien invaders with striking similarities to fascist movements in Latin America. One can see his trademark use of face paint and allegorical image making extending from this film, his second, into Imagens. The difference between the two being that the latter is completely silent. With that, I will hand it on over to Will.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. So when Eric and I both first saw Imagens, we were very surprised by the film because we both believe that it really stands out from the group of films from the cinema marginal movement that were being made during that period. Both in its slow pacing, its sheer brutality, and in its cryptic narrative. After watching the film, I think we can admit we were truly stumped. And throughout the day today, we've continued our arguments, trying to really come up with some kind of idea as to what it's about, what is going on in the film. It's because of that we asked Richard Pena to come and help us, gain some insights into what is taking place in the film. Richard Pena was my teacher about the Cinema Novo movement for an entire semester. And, he's someone that I've always gone to when a Brazilian movie really feels enigmatic to me. So with that, I'm really happy to be able to turn it over to him right now and to learn more about this film from Richard Pena.
Okay, thank you, William, and thank you everybody for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be part of this. I first met Rosemberg when I did my sort of grand tour of Brazil in 1974-75. I spent a lot of time at the Cinemateca do MAN, and there I met a young guy by the name of João Linares, who now is teaching at Brasilia, teaching film history. And we started speaking, and he told me, you should come with me sometime to this kind of workshop that I'm doing with a guy named Rosenberg. So I said, sure. So I showed up, and as soon as I was introduced, Rosenberg said, "You brought an American here? What are you doing? Don't you understand? This is dangerous." But I think he was only half kidding. But anyway, we later became quite friendly, and I went to the seminar a number of times, and more than that, just enjoyed seeing Rosenberg. He was an extraordinarily opinionated person. I don't think I ever asked him about anything where something either wasn't obra prima or uma merda. It's sort of, there were only two choices on the menu for what something could be. But whatever his opinions were, he was happy to share them and happy to explain them. So he was really great to sort of stay in touch with. Over the years, I got to see him a number of times. Before I moved back to New York to work at Lincoln Center, I worked for 8 years at the Art Institute of Chicago, and we had Rosenberg there for a little series of his films in the 1980s, and got to spend some time together. And another time in New York, we were together. And then sadly, we kind of just really stopped seeing each other, just accidentally. There were a number of years I didn't go to Brazil so much, but when I did begin to go back more frequently, say 10, 12 years ago, I did get to see him. You could often find him in the Espaço Itaú in Botafogo, having just come to see a movie or waiting to see a movie and sitting there and a little bit holding court because people knew him and they enjoyed speaking with him. And very happily, the last time I was in Brazil, not long before he died, I got to see him. We spoke for a while, and he said, you have to write to me when you come so we can do some things. And sadly, of course, that never came to happen. He was really quite an extraordinary figure. What I remember about him was just his really almost encyclopedic knowledge of film. He really had a wide understanding and just knowledge of film. He had seen an incredible number of things, and as I said, had very strong opinions about almost all of them. So I'll do my best. I had never seen Imagens, of course, until William was kind enough to give me a link for it. I can't really say that I can tell you what it's about. In fact, I think the film frustrates that. Not being able to speak is, in a certain way, one of the themes of the film. The film actually begins with an image of Rosemberg on a beach. I think it's Rio, actually, because that's where Rosemberg lived, sort of there in a white shirt that's covered with blood and a thick piece of tape across his mouth. So I think this sets up a kind of dichotomy. First of all, obviously, of someone who's been silent, who can't speak, but on the other hand, with all this blood, being very expressive at the same time. So you have that kind of contradictory image of being silent and yet expressing something in ways that perhaps aren't so clear or even so coherent, but the will to express, the will to communicate really comes through. In lots of ways, I think, rather than, well, certainly not a fictional work, a story work in any ways, or even an essay-like work. You mentioned that some of his later films become more essay-like, which is true. This film to me really seems like a series of gestures. And that's not an unusual thing. I think it sort of puts it very much in this period, late 60s, early 70s. There was a number of arts, especially I think in visual arts, and especially I think in performance art, which I think this film has a lot to do with, which I think have that aesthetic of gesture, if you'll say. In lots of ways, I think we see this aesthetic of gesture in many different ways, but principally in terms of how the body is used. Eric mentioned something about the body and its importance in cinema marginal, and I think you see that very clearly here. The body is really, in lots of ways, a site of resistance. Maybe it's the last private space in a dictatorship. And in a certain way, it's interesting how it sort of bounces off a number of things that were happening in Brazil and in the world at that time. You probably know that in the late 60s, early 70s, there was a kind of genre of commercial film which developed, which became known as porno chanchadas, most of which weren't that interesting, but there were some that were very interesting. And actually, Rosenberg liked a number of them quite a bit. And those were, in many ways, films that in their strange way kind of pushed the envelope a little bit in terms of censorship in Brazil, what could be shown and those kinds of things. It was almost like, we can't do politics, so we'll do sex. And they sort of pushed it a little bit that way. I think there's a certain, how could you say, tendency that we find in a film like Imagens, which follows that idea of using sex and sexuality in a kind of subversive way, which of course, again, brings it back to the body. Again, remember, this is a film that's made right at the end of the very darkest time of the Brazilian dictatorship, period from 69 to 73, when Ernesto de Medici was the leader. And that was really the absolute darkest time of the dictatorship. So the film is coming at the end of that. So it's interesting as a kind of reflection of many of those things. Now, again, the body as a site of expression and a site of resistance was, as I mentioned, something you found frequently in a lot of different kinds of art of that period. Just think of the whole wave of body art that went on in that time, all the work of the Austrians and different people who really explored the body. Or, of course, one of the first waves of very conscious or self-consciously feminist artists, many of whom did performance and different kinds of body art work. I'm thinking of Rebecca Horn, Carolee Schneemann, Valley Export. All of these people, again, were often exposing or exploring what you might say the limits of the body. And of course, in Brazil, you had the kind of overarching example of Hélio Oiticica, who was very close to a number of these people. I don't remember Rosenberg ever talking about him, but he was very close, for example, to Neville de Almeida, who was very close to Rosenberg. So I think there's probably some kind of connection there as well. One of the late critic Peter Wollen's most interesting, let me just get my notes here a little bit, sorry. One of the late critic Peter Wollen's most perceptive essays was one called The Two Avant-gardes, which I'm sure many of you have read. And in that, he tries to sort of sketch the differences or create sort of dichotomies between the kind of what you might think of anthology film archive vision of the avant-garde, the world of Brakhage and Darren and Bruce Bailey and all of that, versus the political avant-garde of Godard, Stroud, and a number of other filmmakers, and tries to tease out the differences and create this kind of dichotomy. Well, in a way, what we could say is I think there was at least a third avant-garde, maybe there were more, which I would label maybe the performative avant-garde. And what I mean by that is one that sort of very much was built around a kind of performance art and a kind of acting out, and actually had, I think, a lot of interesting crossovers with radical New York theater at that time, Joseph Chaikin, Richard Foreman, the first Robert Wilson, all that kind of thing, I think was very mixed in it. Again, the lines aren't that clear. I would include in this performative avant-garde figures like, say, Jack Smith and Ron Rice, who were also sort of claimed by the anthology people. So as I said, these lines weren't completely different, but theirs was a kind of theatrical work that was really built on the idea of presentation versus representation. They weren't giving you the image of a world. They were presenting you a series of gestures and expressions kind of about that world. And so I think that's something that you can see moving over to the work of Rosemberg and other people in cinema marginal. But I think perhaps the sort of link is not necessarily to the Americans. I think the only figure I ever heard any of those people talk about from the sort of world of the avant-garde in the US was Warhol. And they were very impressed by his films. And Warhol, of course, was a little bit of an outlier. He did his own thing, and he didn't need anthology, so he didn't really have to depend on that sort of world or that universe. But it's kind of an interesting sort of in between, and I think it probably would give us a good sense of where a film like Imagens is coming from, and that's the existence of a movement that began in Barcelona in Spain in the mid-60s and lasted again, sort of like Cinema Marginal, into the mid-70s. It was called La Gauche Divine, the divine left, or sometimes called the Escuela de Barcelona, the Barcelona School. In the 1960s, there was, of course, a kind of real flowering of a new Spanish cinema. You think people like Carlos Saura, Victor Erice, Manuel Gutierrez Aragon, Pedro Alea, a number of filmmakers who were based in Madrid, who created what you might call a deeply allegorical, almost Kabbalistic cinema, very dense symbols and whatever, because, of course, they were working under Franco and had to make these films that couldn't clearly speak what they wanted to say. Around the same time in Barcelona, a group of artists began to appear, people like Jerry Portabella, Jacinto Esteve, Joaquim Jordá, the architect Ricardo Bonfil. I mean, there are a number of people began making films, but in a way, they really kind of set their difference from the Madrid school. Just like in a way, you could say Cinema Marginal saw Cinema Novo as, on the one hand, an inspiration, but on the other hand, something to move away from. Cinema Novo had become compromised. They had become part of Ember Film, and they were no longer the radicals that they had been. That's one of the reasons all of these people had a real hang up with Glauber, because Glauber Rocha was the only figure who they felt, kind of kept the faith out of all the group in a way. Even this film is dedicated to Glauber. So indeed, I think you can see that connection. For these people in Barcelona, in a way, they saw the work that the people in Madrid were doing, and I guess felt it was less interesting to them as cinema. And of course, they were coming out of a tradition that was much more fine arts oriented. They're a really curious bunch. Some of them came from architecture, some of them came from the world of advertising, all kinds of things. But there's a great statement that sort of sums up their aesthetic, which was Joaquim Jordá once said, "If we can't be Victor Hugo, then maybe we can be Mallarmé." That sense of, if we can't give you a kind of realist, critical vision of Spanish society, let's give you a very free-floating one, almost free association of one. And that's what the films of La Gauche Divine really were. Like the marginal films, they have lots of spurts of violence that comes out of anywhere. in an essay I once wrote about this group, I sort of called it the sort of Manson factor, because it always seems that people sort of suddenly embark on massacres in upper class settings. There's also other aspects that, you know, I think tie them together. Again, a real interest often in the world of the upper bourgeoisie, where a lot of these filmmakers actually came from. In Barcelona, real interest in the world of advertising and pop culture. That also comes through with Marginals, but their pop culture is a little bit sort of more popular. It's kind of for home music or newspapers like tabloids like Ugia and things like that. So lots of interesting connections between them. I first made this connection because you probably know that when Glauber Rocha left Brazil in 1968 or early 69 and went to Cannes to show Antonio das Mortes, and then went to Africa to make Der Leone have Sete Cabeças, when he came back, or when he finished that film, he didn't go back to Brazil. That was the beginning of his exile. He went to Barcelona. And in fact, his film Cabeças Cortadas is produced by two of the people from this movement. So that was the first time I sort of thought maybe there was a link between these guys. And I think certainly whatever the kind of, I mean, there's an actual link because Glauber was working with these people. But in fact, I think they recognized in each other maybe a little bit of a kindred spirit. And that's one of the things that, that I think we can get out of this group. So I think, you know, when we think of the cinema marginal, I think we can think of them as, you know, not certainly anthology avant-garde, nor avant-garde in the sort of Godard, Straub, and even Glauber Rocha sense, but something in between, a kind of acting out, a kind of performance, a way in which the kind of things, you know, in a way, often I think rather advanced, things like bad taste, shocking the audience, and things like that are very much almost the very idea of what these films are. Indeed, I think one of the things that Imagens does, and again, the connection to Glauber is interesting, is really build on one of the most remarkable features of Terra em Transe, Earth in Trance, Glauber's great masterpiece from 1967. One of the most notable things in that film, of course, are the number of sequences of direct address, when characters turn to the audience and begin speaking to them, you know, getting rid of that fourth wall or whatever, and establishing that kind of contact. You think of the great sequence when, of course, the union leader speaks, and then Paulo Martins comes over and, you know, covers up his mouth. That idea of kind of direct address to the audience is something that Rosemberg does here, but of course, the direct address is never a verbal address. It's the kind of physical address. And again, we have characters who look right at the camera, and in a certain way, just as they do in Glauber's film, bring up the question of spectatorship. You know, what are we looking at? Why are we looking at this? You know, who are we to look at this? And I think the film brings up those questions, especially in some of the sequences that you get in the film, which are very typical for marginal films, which is the long sequence we have of torture, when the man with the beard, sort of blonde haired, is being tortured by this guy in a bathing suit with a cross, you know, who keeps kind of choking him and poking him with this cross. And the sequence goes on far longer than you would need to establish what's going on, that someone's being tortured. And of course, the reason he's being tortured is never explained to us or whatever. But it's almost as if we go from observers to almost participants, and then finally almost to victims in a way, that we ourselves begin to feel oppressed just by the length of this. So there's an interesting way in which that whole sort of process kind of charts out, and seeing the way that our reaction to this changes over time, how we go from just watching it to, in a certain way, almost being part of it, then finally almost feeling that we're the victim ourselves, and we have to sit through so much of what's going on. Let me see if there's a couple of other notes that I have or anything else I can say that's interesting. Talked about audience address. No, I guess that's probably about it. Okay, well, those are just a few ideas, hopefully that rang true for some of you, or maybe inspired a few other thoughts or ideas about the film, but those are some of the things that I got from it. Again, as I said, it's really a film of gestures, and I think it's a collection of gestures in a way. One could say it begins and ends with Images of Rosemberg, and maybe that's the structuring principle of it in a way. And of course, we have these people walking through the film, again, sort of, somehow distant. Sometimes actually who they remind me of are characters. I just thought of this because I remember it was one of Rosenberg's favorite films. Reminded me almost of people that you see in La Jetée, in the people who seem to be in between periods of time. Maybe that's it. And then finally, as Eric also mentioned about the face painting, I always think of that in Rosenberg's work as a little bit of a nod to tropicalism. Is that in a certain way, these people who you see otherwise dressed up in a kind of haute bourgeois fashion have face paint on that ties them clearly to native Brazilians, so that there's that kind of way in which the so-called primitive always seeps through, even in seemingly the most advanced settings. That was one of the big themes of tropicalism, and I think it's something that comes out in Rosenberg's work. No matter how refined, or perhaps especially as people are more refined, the cruelty is that much worse, and often that's the theme we see in the films. Okay, I think I'll stop there if I can, and I don't know, William, leave it up to you.
Thank you, Professor Pena. That was really excellent and insightful. I think it's important that we don't take everything you just gave over for granted, because as I mentioned earlier, Imagens was a film that for 40 years was considered lost. Without film preservation, we're not going to have Brazilian cinema, and without archival workers to preserve those films, we're never going to have the opportunity to discover them. And it is with that I'd like to turn over to José Quintal, because he was a big part of the reason as to why we were all able to actually watch Imagens, and to be able to translate the film and to be able to discuss it right now. With that, José, thank you.
Hello, how are you? And good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. Thank you, William. Thank you, Eric, for the invitation. It's also an honor to be sharing this screen with Professor Richard Pena. Thank you for this analysis of the film and the work of Rosenberg. I would like to start by saying how important it is to that we are discussing here the preservation of films, in particular Brazilian films. Like William said in the beginning, especially in this context, we are experiencing here in Brazil the situation of Cinemateca Brasileira. I would like also to underline the space that Cine Limite has been open for this issue, not only to talk about preservation itself, but also by showing films that address this theme, such as Nitrato by Alain Fresneau, or the beautiful film I loved one, this Que Cavação é Essa, by Luiz Alberto Rocha Mello and Estevão Garcia. So the idea to talk about a little bit about this recovery of Imagens. It came with Jardim das Espumas, both films I found in Paris in 2014. But first, this invitation came at the same time here in Cinemateca do MAN. We are organizing this retrospective of Rosenberg's films. It's starting next Monday. So I'm going to share after my speech the link to the website we are creating. We are putting in there next Monday to show these films. Many of these films, or almost 60 films of Rosenberg, and also some visual works he made, these collages. He made out for many years, for during his whole life. It will be a very beautiful retrospective and tribute to Rosenberg. So Imagens was made in 1972. During Rosenberg was living in Paris. but he came to Brazil for a small trip, and he did Imagens in 60 millimeters. And the film was showed for some private sections, so restricted sessions, and had no commercial release. Then he traveled back to France and hiding this film in the bottom of his suitcase. You can imagine why after this analysis, no? All this, the situation. So in 2014, I was living in Paris doing my PhD, and I started looking for the film because Hernani Hefner, the actual director of Cinémathèque du Mans, at the time he was the head of the film collection. He asked me to try to find this film, both films, Jardim das Espumas and Imagens, films that Rosenberg had in mind. It was in France, because when Rosenberg came to France and he came back to Brazil in 1974, he left these films in France. So I found these two films in the collection of the French Association Collectif Jeune Cinéma, a cinema group created in 1971, dedicated to the exhibition of experimental cinema in France. This group was created as a cooperative of experimental directors and has the central figure called Marcel Mazet, who played a fundamental role in the diffusion of experimental and avant-garde cinema in France. Mazet passed away in 2012, but for many years he organized one of the most important film festivals in France, the festival du Jeune Cinéma de hier. Imagens from the Rosemberg Imagens was awarded in 1973 during this festival. So, like I said, Hernani Hefner asked me to try to find these films in the Cinémathèque, in the French archives, because they were organizing a tribute to Rosenberg during the festival in Ouro Preto, the Ouro Preto Film Festival. In fact, it's important to underline that Cinémathèque du Mans was already been working on the recovered Rosenberg films, trying to increase some visibility and produce new conservation materials for his work. In 2011, for example, the Cinemateca had made 2 new 35 millimeters copies of 2 important films from Rosenberg, Crônica de um Industrial e O Santo e a Vedete. But also Rosenberg was trying to find his films. After 40 years, he lost. So a friend of mine and also who collaborated with Rosenberg before me was trying to find this film in France. So I talked with her, Ana Coutinho, a student anthropologist. She started this research, and I continued from them. So I went to the principal archives in France at first. So I went to Cinémathèque Française, I went to the French Film Archive, and a colleague of mine is expert in cinema and experimental cinema called Sébastien Rosseret, who was the one who suggested me to take a look in the Collectif Jeune Cinéma, in this catalog, and bingo, the film was there. At the same time, the Collectif Jeune Cinéma was trying to reach Rosenberg at the same time, because they want to show this film again, and were trying to reach Rosenberg. So it was a big, good coincidence. So they were both two positive 6mm copies was in the film. They were in great condition because the film were not shown very often during all these years. So precisely because of this restricted circulation, both copies were in very good shape. A few scratches and not many damage in the supports. And of course, the film were in good conditions of preservation too. So with the collaboration of Universo Produção, who organized the film festival of Ouro Preto Film Festival, we were able to start the process of digitization of this material. So they paid for this process. Was made in the professional lab in Paris. And we decided to keep these films in Paris because they were the only copies we had of this film. So we work with the digital representation of both films. So we're just to start this conversation. We can continue to talk during the questions, but it's important to underline that we're very happy these films can circulate this to now, for example, being shown here in New York. And after Rosemberg passed away, his brother put all his materials in Cinemateca do Man. So we got this his collection of scripts, visual works, his library, hundreds of texts and published materials. So this and these tributes we are organizing now here at the Cinemateca. It's this. We hope this the starting point to organize all this material and put back to the public.
Thank you, Jose. Before asking questions about Imagens specifically, Eric and I would like to keep on a topic of preservation and also include Professor Richard Pena within that conversation, because in preparation for this event, Eric sent myself a essay written by someone named Claudio Solano. And that essay provided a snapshot in English, so it's rare, about the independent film movement in Brazil in the 70s and the 80s. One thing that we both noted within the document is that numerous names were coming up of filmmakers and even critics whose work we had never even heard of or ever had the opportunity to see. And it's with that I'm wondering, first from Richard Pena, if you can speak a little bit about while you were in Brazil, how big was this independent film movement? You can call it Cinema Marginal, you could call it Cinema de Invenção, but really how large was it? And if you can provide us a snapshot of just the environment within that sense, outside of the main canonical filmmakers from Cinema Marginal that we know. Then to José Quintal, you work at the Cinemateca do Man, and of course you guys have one of the largest collection of films from that period. I'm wondering what have been the real challenges in making accessible and really expanding the canon, the Cinema Marginal canon, in providing a larger point of view, because as we realized with a film like Imagens, it's a work that for 40 years we weren't able to discover, and then upon discovering it, it's opened up so many doors and so many new ideas just about that period. I have the suspicion that there's a lot more that came from. So can you guys maybe speak about what have been the challenges to preserve and make accessible those works, and really, how big was this movement?
Well, I guess I should start. One of the things which, if you recall, William, I emphasized in our class is that I think a real characteristic of Brazilian cinema is its regionalism. Brazil is a very big place, and because of that, there have always been a number of centers of cinema. Eric mentioned before, São Paulo was the head of Cinema Marginal. To an extent, Rio certainly had lots of filmmakers, but then there were filmmakers in other parts of the country, in Bahia, Rio Grande do Sul. So, and again, because these films were 16 millimeter, because most of them had little or no hope of being commercial films in any way, people made them and then they passed around these kind of like very quiet, I want to say underground, but almost underground circuits. I mean, I can remember the year that I was in Brazil, 74, 75, there'd be like midnight screenings at the old Cinema where you'd go and you'd see some of these new films that people had made. And, a lot of these films, I have no idea whatever happened to them. I mean, after that particular screening. So indeed, it was pretty widespread. I mean, by then, 16 millimeter had become a lot more common in Brazil. And that really, and there were film schools and things like that, that opened up a lot more people to making films. So indeed, I think to do a proper catalog would be difficult because indeed there were so many films and filmmakers who were, might have left cinema after one film. They made one film, then went off to do something else in their lives. It was not like Cinema Nova where there was this real pretension or idea of really starting a Brazilian film industry. These people, part of their marginality is that's not what they wanted to do.
Yes, many of these films, 16 millimeter films, they don't have a negative, or we don't have the materials to preserve them. And the difficult to film, they put all the energy to film new films and don't care a lot about the preservation of this. And many of some of these filmmakers took these films or his own films to remake new films. So like Luiz Gonzala, who works a lot of his own films to like an archive, his own archive, who's going to do this. So it's hard to organize all this film to dialogue with the canon of this Cinema Novo also. But it's important to know that in the 2000, in fact, we have this movement to reveal these films, to reveal the films of Cinema Marginal, or even Rosemberg was not really marginal, like you said. Imagens is dedicated to Glauber Rocha. He made many films in 35 millimeters. It's a different way. He made many films in video during the 90s. So I'd like to underline this. In the 2000, we have this the Cinema Marginal retrospective. We have this Júlio Bressani retrospectives in 2002. Luiz Gonzala's retrospective in 2005, and many of these films were recovered at this point. So to this retrospective, so it's Rosenberg was, even if we think in the Cinema Marginal, Rosenberg it's marginal to the biggest names, no?
Yeah. Jose, to follow up on that, first I'd like to ask you about lower resolution formats such as VHS, Beta, and TV rips. And if you look at a wider array of Brazilian Cinema Marginal films, you're no doubt going to come into contact with works that are only available in, for example, a VHS scan, in a scan from a Betamax, or in a particularly low-res scan. So I'm wondering, can you talk about the importance of preserving those kind of formats to have allowed people to still discover the films? And then you just mentioned the retrospectives that were done in the early 2000s. In what way did those early formats and those TV screenings open the door for someone like Eugênio Popo, for example, to to get all the films on DVD and to do a big Cinema Marginal retrospective. How did that open the path for that kind of thing?
Well, it's many of these films, they survive in these formats. That's for sure. So you need to preserve all the home videos formats. But I don't know if I understand this question, the question about this, about Eugênio Poo, because he was working with these films in film, not with the digital format. So
Sure. I think I was specifically referring to providing that first access and allowing people to just know about the films in and of itself. So you can't program a film. You can't work to restore a film if you don't even know it exists. And in the case of, for example, the article that I just mentioned, with all of those names that I never heard of, it'd be tough for me to, for example, want to begin a new preservation project, having never had the opportunity to even know what they are. And it seems to me that even still today, a big way that we can discover some of these works are the VHS formats. So I was particularly wondering, I know that the Cinemateca do MAM has a large collection of VHS, DVD, beta, and it's an important prioritization of that archive to ensure that you're preserving films on that format. So maybe to be more specific, why is that so important to preserve films in that format for the Cinemateca do MAM?
Well, often I think, if I can just speak for a second, I think you can almost look at film history, think of all the films that were made on 35 millimeter. Not all of them were transferred to 16 millimeter back when they had 16 millimeter libraries. Then when VHS came along, an even smaller sample made it to VHS, and I would wager that a smaller sample still has made it to DVD. So sometimes, for example, a few years ago when I was still at Lincoln Center and I was trying to do a retrospective of the great Italian comedian Totò, a lot of those films just simply weren't on DVD. I found VHS copies in different places from which I could then make my selection. So I was grateful. That's why I fight to keep a VHS machine in my office at Columbia, because I still look at my VHSs every now and then. The material just doesn't exist in other formats.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was a way to not expensive way to put these films and to make some home telecines, home way. You can use this like a way to show, because that's why it's important to preserve all these formats. Like if you think about Rosenberg in the beginning of the 2000s, he went to a lab to put this 35 millimeters in beta digital or beta cams, Umatics, and so we have this source now. We don't have maybe we don't have the 35 millimeter negative, but we can use this to retrospective like this one we're working right now.
Yeah, thank you.
So for Professor Pena, you were speaking about this third avant-garde as represented by a sort of performance, a relationship to performance art, and that was really interesting to me, because I've been looking recently at the Bel Air films of Scanzerla and Bressani, and I always felt that they were, and this extends to most cinema marginal, I always felt that they were closer to someone like Jack Smith than they were to any other sort of art house or anthology type avant-garde, and I always wondered about this, because there's very little presence in Brazilian film history, or at least from what I've encountered, of this first type of avant-garde, sort of materialist, non-representational filmmaking, and I never made the connection to the Spaniards, but when you brought up Portobello, I thought that was a very apt comparison with Filho. And I guess I'm wondering what I know that Rosenberg was a very well-read and cultured person. He loved opera and all of these things. But I guess I'm wondering where, what are some of the sources that from which this performativity, this aesthetic of gesture arises from? Because I also got feelings of surrealism and symbolism, referring to the art movement, in his aesthetics. So I was wondering if you had anything to say about that.
Well, it's obviously a big issue. I mean, I would say,
Professor, I think you're muted.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, I could hear.
Oh, can you hear me
you're
now?
good. Yeah.
Okay. I think what I would say is that someone like Rosenberg and maybe even the Bel Air folks would have said what they were doing was the logical extension of what Cinema Novo had started, but the Cinema Novo turned traitor up to. That a lot of that performativity you can find in some of Glauber, you can find in, Fome d'Amour, you can find in a number of Brazilian films. And I think what happened, it's almost like, the Children's Crusade. It's like, where are you going now? Why are you making that? Weren't you making this other? I mean, Glauber made O Câncer, which maybe is, along with Imagens, the origin of cinema marginal in Marginal. So there was a way in which I think they saw themselves, I think, as not necessarily creating something, but going from where they thought the movement was showing them. They were taking it further. They were, moving it on maybe with influences from other places. But, I often think that they really felt, we're the real Cinema Novo. We're the guys who, it's not so much we broke, you broke with Cinema Novo. We didn't. We're, continuing your promise. So in that way, it was kind of like Children's Crusade or something like that.
So Jairo Ferreira, we have a quote from him, which we found really interesting. He says, of Imagens, I remember some scenes of total cruelty in the erotic dialectic of politics/poetics, in the vibrant sign of the window. We don't know what that means exactly, but it says a scissor taken to the graph of tension in the narrative. Perhaps the most expressive image of castration in all of the experimentation post-68. So one of the things that we've felt differentiates Imagens from other works of the period are its seemingly, well, you mentioned, Professor Pena, you mentioned how the camera holds on the torture for very long. And it's almost pseudo-poetic. It's almost a pseudo-poetic depiction of torture. Unlike the many Eisenstein influenced filmmakers of that period, it seems that Rosenberg was embracing something more on the tunes of like Strabure was doing. And I'm wondering if either you or José Quintal can kind of expand on where he would have gotten those influences from, that kind of slow cinema style and aesthetic, and why from that perspective and from that time period would that have been an effective means of depicting these images in comparison, for example, to a film that killed the family and went to the movies. The shot of torture is a very distant shot, so you can't really see the details. In a film like Manhã Cinzenta, it's a little bit more expressed, I think, visually, but this is the rare case where you see a close-up of a man's genitalia and blood going over it, and a knife, and you see someone being tortured via his mouth for so long. Why was slow cinema the approach there, do you guys think?
Why wasn't slow cinema?
Why wasn't his approach to depicting those images instead of the kind of frenzy, the kind of immediate anger, the intense montage?
I mean, again, if you want to do a point of comparison, if I may, I think, you think of Kill the Family and Went to the Movies, which has a scene of torture in it. I consider that a moment of what the Yugoslav filmmaker Dusan Makavejević used to call smuggling it in. In other words, you want to talk about torture, it's 1969, but you just can't say torture, you have to put it in some context that seems almost nonsensical, and because of that, you can just throw it in, well, it's just like, well, then he went home and he killed his wife, the whole thing seems, I don't want to say like a joke, but there's something that seems so incoherent, it's hard to think of it as having a message and subversive. So I would say that was an example of Bressani smuggling in the idea of torture, which was happening a lot in Brazil in 1969, through that. I think Rosenberg's not after that. I think he doesn't have to smuggle it in. I think he's into the experience of it, not in a sadistic way, but in a way in which he really wants us to go through torture, to not only watch it, but feel, a certain participation and finally feel a certain victimhood by it. Because in a certain way, obviously, we're not being physically tortured. We have to watch this, And as I said, again and again, I think the film perhaps poses the question to us, what are you watching and why are you watching this? And I think those are interesting questions for a film, and for a filmmaker. So.
Jose, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think it's about the radicality of this film. Rosenberg is I think it's the most radical filmmakers at this time. The much more radical than the other, than Bressani or than Gonzala. His films have no concessions. That's why his films were censored or not released. Or this film's Imagens was not commercial. That no commercial release to this film. So he put in the suitcase and go to Europe because it's not possible to be shown in Brazil at this time. Jardim das Espumas, he showed this commercial in a commercial way, but Imagens, it's just not possible to do that. And you can see this during all his career, I think. And then you have the opportunity to see many of these films from Monday, next Monday, to see everything together, to have this idea of radicality in his films.
To get a sort of sense, I guess, an interior sense of that radicality, since you knew him back then, Professor Pena, what was his, I guess, disposition towards, his public disposition towards the dictatorship? I mean, obviously the sense is that nobody really could say anything at the height of repression, but clearly it was on everybody's minds, and he seemed to be more outspoken than most. So I guess, how did his words match up to his art?
I mean, I was young, and I hope I, took in as much as I should have. I had actually, the first time I went to Brazil was for a brief period, about 10 days in 1972. And then I went back in 74, 75 and took a year off the university and went there. That was already Geisel. And, in a way, it seemed quite different. I mean, yes, it was a dictatorship, but there was abertura, there was opening, and one felt it in lots of things, and bit by bit, more and more things were being allowed by the censor. So I think you had, people knew where the power was, but there was much more of a sense that people were getting along and didn't have to be scared, as much as I think I wasn't there, but, I think people in 71, 72 were really scared, as well they should have been. It was a brutal regime. By 74, 75, when I was there, things had really calmed down quite a bit. And I think there was a sense of the country moving in a different direction. Rosenberg was still as critical of it. I think he was less accepting of, Geisel or whatever. But I think, again, I think for him, the big disappointment was that all these filmmakers who had been so inspirational to him from Cinema Novo, he just felt had completely lost their way. And that was the big thing. I mean, he would never say, he would hold the candle out for Glauber as being still the one who kept the faith. But, whatever you said, oh, how tasty is my little French, uma merda, everything, Guerra Conjugal, uma merda, everything was just terrible,
Wow.
But I think you know, it was a rejection. I mean, he could not like it, but a lot of it, I think, was almost, I won't say personal, but I mean, it was sort of like that these people had betrayed, you know, what the promise of Cinema Novo had been. And yeah, that was the thing I always felt with him, that it was, you know, obviously an argument that was based on an aesthetic vision, but there was a kind of very personal element to it. You know, that these people had not done what they should have, that they were co-opted.
Right.
Jose Quintal mentioned censorship, and I'd like to ask you guys both about that, because in a talk that Fabio Andrade gave for the film Copacabana Mon Amour, back when Spectacle was doing a retrospective for Scanzerla last year, he touched on what was the risk of making a film like this. And I briefly just mentioned Only Sao Paulo, someone who actually was tortured by the military for his film, Mania Cinzenta, I believe. And I'm wondering, can either of you give us a sense of, you know, when we think about political filmmaking, obviously there's putting the ideas in the film. Then there's also the filmmaker that literally is putting their life on the line to put together these images and to put together these ideas and to put together some kind of liberation, some kind of forward movement. In a case of a film like this, was the risk beyond just censorship? Was a filmmaker like Luiz Rosemberg Filho really putting his life on the line to depict these images?
I think so. I think so. It was dangerous at the time to do these films, and for example, some of these films were kept by the Cinemateca do Man because filmmakers was scared, or he couldn't keep the films at home with him, like Manhã Cinzenta. Manhã Cinzenta was one of the films who Cinemateca do Man keep saving during 20 years, 25 years, hiding these films, or Cabra Marcado para Morrer. It's film. Some of these films were because this image put in risk the lives of the filmmakers, and put in risk the lives of the director of Cinemateca do Man also, because we can remember Cosme Alves Neto was the director, the major director of this historical director of Cinemateca do Man. He was tortured. He was arrested and tortured in '69 during, and all these films, all the program of the Cinemateca do Man passed by censorship. They need to, when they are present the program, and then it was a risk also to the programmer and the director of Cinemateca.
Well, also this isn't doesn't have to do with Rosenberg specifically, but to sort of demonstrate how people were putting their lives on the line. There's an anecdote from Neville de Almeida when he made Mangi Bangi. Well, less of an anecdote rather than just a production process. He shot the film, and as soon as he was done shooting, he left the country before processing the film, before editing it, before anything. And I haven't seen it yet, but it's apparently a film with scatology and violence, and but in any case, this was a period of heavy exile for many of these filmmakers, and a lot of some of them, like Bressani and Scanzerla, got a heads up and didn't really have to fear much, but a lot of them were scared for their lives and for being tortured. But to move on to the Q&A portion, Fabio Andrade has a question for us. He says, expanding on Professor Peña's insight, sorry, I keep hearing myself. Expanding on Professor Pena's insight on the Barcelona school, I was wondering if you've noticed a kinship as well with the Zanzibar group. At times, Imagens reminds me of the work of Philippe Garel was making at the time, and I wonder if there's a similar relationship between the Zanzibar group and the Nouvelle Vague as there was between Rosemberg and Cinema Novo. All I can say is I also felt a kinship with Garel while watching Imagens again this time.
I guess I have to think about that a bit. I think of the Zanzibar group as, again, also a group that seems to be wanting to return to the origins of the new wave, you know, wanting to go back to the spirit and the feeling of those early films. I guess I think of them as less performative than I do the films of the Barcelona school, but maybe those are just the ones that I'm thinking of right now. And I'm sure there were other things. Again, one of the things that happens in the late 60s, early 70s is that there's this marked return to a certain kind of theatricality that happens. I mean, look at the new German cinema. I mean, it comes out of theater, Fassbinder and, so many of those people were theater people. And I think it just becomes much more in the air, this sense of theatricality, which people do different things with.
So right now we have a Q&A open. We're here for another 10 minutes. If anybody has any other questions, please feel free to drop them. Meanwhile, I want to move on to the conversation or the topic of, or the person of Paulo Emilio Salles Gomez. In that article that I read in preparation for this, it highlights the importance that that figure had. In the fact that he was willing to write about low quality cinema, so to speak, porno chanchadas, cinema marginal films, and his willingness to kind of inspire a new generation of filmmakers that, there are other paths to audiences, there are other paths to filmmaking outside of Cinema Novo. Can either of you, I know Professor Pena, you knew Paulo Emilio, can either of you kind of speak about the influence that he had as a kind of cultural figure, as an important critic to this new generation of filmmakers?
I think his influence on Cinema Novo was enormous. I think that he was much read and much admired. I mean, he was kind of, in a certain way, the link to a certain kind of European modernism and a kind of certain European modernist thought and whatever. And he translated their work in those terms. So, I think he was of enormous importance. I think I know that he liked some of the Cinema Marginal. I don't know how much of a personal relationship he had with a lot of them. It could be that he knew them all, but I knew he knew, what's his name? Candeias. He liked Candeias a lot. He's really a big defender of Imagens. He thought that was really a great, great film. But again, I don't know what his relation was with Bressani and people like that. I'm sure he met them or knew them, but he had a much closer relationship to Glauber, to Joaquim Pedro, to a couple of people like that.
So one person just mentioned me a question about the use of advertisements in the film. There's obviously, there's a lot of archival images specifically. We have images of Nazi marches, first of all.
Those are actually integralist marches. Those are the integralists who were kind of Brazilian fascist group that grew up in the 30s. And those are all integralistas who are marching.
So that's very interesting to know. And I think beyond those images, we also see a lot of, as you mentioned earlier, Professor Pena, a lot of kind of advertisements, a lot of pop culture propaganda. But it's weird because you'll see him cutting from an image of breakfast to a man being tortured. And obviously, there's some kind of correlation between his idea about the role of pop culture, the role of images, and some kind of influence that maybe the United States had as well on everybody, essentially. Can you guys maybe speak about a little bit about the history, first of all, of the US's kind of presence in Brazil at that period, and why there would have been such a skepticism about the role of ads, the role of propagandistic images on everybody.
Well, I guess what you could say is, in a way, the guarantor and the imprimatur of the dictatorship was the U.S. I mean, while I think the dictatorship had all kinds of local causes and reasons, the one who guaranteed it and said, "Oh yes, this is really for the greater good of the country," was the U.S. And that was so. I think that. And I think that, and the bet of the dictatorship is we're going to improve everyone's life materially so much that, you don't have press freedom, forget about it, or, later maybe. So I think all of that is to kind of always bring that materialist side, of all these things, which again gave an image of a certain false prosperity, because obviously very few people in Brazil were of that level of prosperity, but it was the idea that it was aspirational, that now Brazil was part of this great world of capitalist consumption or something along those lines. So I think it often has that kind of meaning. Again, as I said, it's another interesting sort of crossover with the Barcelona School, whose films are full of advertisements and fashion and all kinds of things like that, curious. But again, I think it's, in the case of Brazil, it's a little bit that idea of the good life, that the dictatorship has given you.
So we have two questions here, and those will be the last ones. Yanis Siligakis asks, what was the viewership of these films, and how has this viewership changed over time? Do we have data to infer the evolution of the viewership? We mentioned really these films are going into suitcases, right? And now if you look on YouTube, you'll see 50,000 to 100,000 views and more. So I think that might be an indication as to their ever increasing popularity. I know also after the major Cinema Marginal events, there was a big boom in interest in the topic in universities as a research topic, and you saw a lot of new theses on that. So I think it's changed dramatically over time. I don't know if Professor Pena or Jose, if you guys have an opinion on the matter either. Okay, so then we'll move on to the last question. It's by Gustavo. He says he wonders if the face painting pattern in Jardim das Espumas and Imagens mean that there's some basis for us to say Imagens is set in the same planet of Jardim, and so we're watching aliens. He also cautions to say that he might be overthinking it, but it's certainly something which I've been debating with Eric, and we believe it is so. Do either of you equally think that might be the case?
I mentioned before that looking at the film, when I saw some of the characters and the way they were positioned, it reminded me of La Jetée, which again, they're not aliens, but they're people from the future. So there's a certain alien quality to them. And I wonder, I know it was a film that Rosemberg loved, so I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if he, thought of that, or that's kind of filtered in the film somehow. But yeah, no, that sounds about right, And also, I mean, these people seem caught between worlds. I mean, they have, the sort of 19th century dress on, and they're wandering around with this priest, and you look at the furnishings in their homes and stuff like that. And yet there's something very contemporary about them at the same time. They open refrigerators. So, I mean, these people are kind of in this strange other world, that seems to transcend past, present, and future.
But there is also a way to read it as a almost sequel to his first film. The face paint is similar. The presence of the beings is similar. Jose, what do you think about that? Whether it might be a sequel or interpreted as such?
I don't know. Maybe it's a good interpretation. I really I need to see again the Jardim das Espumas. I saw but to compare the director to compare, but yes, it's the film came just first of this one. So
well, with that, I think it's 7:27. I want to thank everybody so much for coming together to discuss this film, to talk about preservation, and to help us further understand Imagens. This has been a really great event. It's been excellent to hear your perspectives.